One of the most frustrating things for people who feel passionately about politics is arguing with someone who disagrees and just doesn't seem to get it. You know what's going on. You've got experience. You've seen the evidence. You've thought this through carefully. You present your wisdom to your ideological opponent, absolutely certain in your flawless logic and incontrovertible evidence, and still they don't change their mind. You scream, insult your challenger's intelligence, education, and morality, and walk away, more and more convinced that the human race is doomed. Can't fix stupid. Sound familiar? The fascinating thing is that both challengers will walk away thinking this. Each will be perplexed that the other is so stupid, so stubborn, so ignorant, so wrong. How can it be the case that both people with opposite opinions can be so thoroughly convinced they have it right? The short answer is that, people have different ways of looking at things. In other words, we have different ways of interpreting reality. The longer answer is that there are very good reasons we have different ways of interpreting reality. The frustrating answer is that people often have a very difficult time understanding other people's ways of looking at reality and an even harder time adjusting their own, even if this view of reality would be judged by a reasonable person to be absurd. Let's start with a concept: subjectivity. People are subjective. What does that mean? We need to compare the term to its opposite, objective. To be objective is to see the world as it is, in an unbiased way, and without an agenda. Who's objective? Well, you are, of course. You're not biased, are you? If you're wise, you already know you're not objective, because no one is. Maybe there is some ultimate true reality. So what? You're human, which means all you get is a brain capable of solving problems that come up in the life of humans. You're not a god. You're not a perfectly logical supercomputer. Whatever the entirety of reality is, you can't perceive it, let alone understand it. So we understand things as best as we can, within the limits of our human senses, our human brains, and the human knowledge we've managed to acquire. These limitations impact our ability to see things as they really are. Think about how much people have discovered about the world and universe in just the last few hundred years. In just the last few decades, really. We now know that our old ways of looking at things, flat earth, disease caused by evil spirits, were wrong. And yet we took these things for granted. Our limited knowledge is our only guide to interpreting reality. And sure, new knowledge is developed. As we go through life, we have the opportunity to learn quite a bit. So why can't that dumbass you're arguing with take the time to learn what you know and change his mind? One thing we have to realize about the human brain is it's lazy. That's not a bad thing. Everything about the human body is geared towards saving energy. It's a great characteristic for preserving calories in a world where resources are often scarce. But it puts some real limits on our thinking. Thinking about something we already have familiarity with is easier because the neural pathways have already been formed. The energy needed to make them has already been spent. Your muscles work by the same principle. If you've built up your shoulders, push-ups are easy, but building them up took time, effort, and pain. Trying to understand new things means forming new neural pathways, and that costs energy. Calories. Unless we're really curious about something, we tend to feel unmotivated to learn it, just like we feel unmotivated to shovel the snow off the driveway. It's a pain in the ass. This is why we hate to learn new software or get used to a new email format when you've been using the classic one for years. In other words, we don't like changing our minds. We're naturally stubborn and often can't be bothered to adjust our maps of reality. The result is what psychologists call confirmation bias, our tendency to notice evidence for what we already believe and ignore or dismiss evidence that contradicts it. This is why, when you try to make your argument to someone who thinks very differently than you, they don't seem to hear you. They brush aside your perspective because it strains their brain to even give it a try. They immediately return to a way of thinking they're used to, one that makes sense to them. They respond to you by presenting how they see the world based on neural pathways that do not exist in your brain. Your neural pathways were built differently. How can this make sense? How can we live in the same world with such different ways of thinking? It's the natural way the brain works, but how can this be when it causes so much trouble? We can understand the construction of neural pathways better by thinking about how it worked in primitive society. Back then, life was pretty simple, and the things you needed to know were pretty obvious. Most anyone you were likely to have a conversation with had more or less the same life experience as you, exposure to the same knowledge of how the world worked, exposure to the same ideas of how people should live. Certainly people varied and had different opinions on how to do certain things, but it seems unlikely they would have argued about the basic nature of reality. And since they belonged to the same small group, people living in primitive society would have had more or less the same interests. So when it came to making decisions about the way our little society should be run, what was good for you would also tend to be good for me. Same knowledge, same experience, same ideas, same interests, same worldview, some very similar neural pathways. No tweet wars. Obviously, the sameness no longer applies. Even though we may live in the same nation, that country is made up of hundreds of millions of individuals living in very different situations. Different ethnic groups, different religions, different regions, different lifestyle choices, different social classes. Many, many different ways of making a living. The end result is that people have become increasingly more likely to form worldviews, maps of reality, that are quite different. So today, when you argue with someone, there are many opportunities for disagreement. Each of you has different stacks of information in your heads and different well-worn explanations of what in fact is going on in the world. So even if you're both looking at the same thing, you can have different interpretations of the information. Imagine a single mother towing 4 kids and buying groceries with food stamps. 2 people observe the scene. The first is a highly educated social scientist who has learned that capitalist economies produce a certain rate of poverty, that sex education and reproductive health care are unavailable to many, and that poor women often end up as single moms because marriage may not be the best option when men with stable employment are scarce. That's a lot to think about. The other observer of the scene is a working class person who has learned through experience what happens when people engage in risky behavior. The first person sees the scene as a predictable outcome of our social system. The second person sees the outcome of bad decisions. Which perspective sees this reality for what it is? Which interpretation is right? Consider this. Because it's hard to get all the information we need to truly understand something, it's entirely possible that both parties are partially right in their assessment and partially wrong. And even if people agree on the available information and interpret it in the same way, they may hold different values, different opinions about what constitutes a desirable outcome. Let's say one is conservative, the other liberal. Even if both agree that poverty is a predictable outcome of free market capitalism, the liberal argues that the state should help poor families, and the conservative argues that people should not start families until they achieve economic stability. Are either of these positions completely unreasonable? It is possible that, in an argument, one party is very much out of step with what a reasonable person would consider reality. And it's likely that at many points in your life you've realized you yourself were fantastically wrong about how you saw the world and altered your map of reality. You came to a realization and did the work of changing your mind. The thing is, again, it is work. Changing your mind is like changing a tire or oil in your car. It's a pain in the ass. If your worldview more or less works for you, you keep using it. Most people don't have a driving need to make their view of reality more accurate. More likely, they have a driving need to feel comfortable. So it is that we often believe things simply because we want to, because it's easiest and feels best. Indeed, though people are capable of thinking with some objectivity, that doesn't seem to be our natural first tendency. Instead, we seem to be feelers and believers and conformers first, thinkers last. Even if you don't feel strongly about the political or religious ideas available to your mind, you are under pressure from your group or society to accept them. Do you believe what you believe because you've carefully thought it through, or because it feels good to agree with and be accepted by others? Each of us is born into a society with a culture that was well established before we got here. Our culture provides us with a multitude of ideas about what reality is and how it should be interpreted. It's not really natural to critically examine the ideas provided to us by culture. More likely, we take it for granted. We could talk all day about why cultures differ and why people in different societies have predictably different ways of viewing reality. The system of ideas that go with your natural tendency, left or right, also already exists as part of political thought in your culture. People created liberal and conservative doctrine centuries ago. The particulars of these belief systems change. People weren't debating transgender bathrooms in 500 BC, but the basic nature of them remains the same over time. You are born and eventually hear these ideas. One set of them makes more sense or feels better to you. So let's start again and consider that unreasonable jackass you're arguing with. Is he stupid? Ignorant? Cruel? Naive? Immoral? Unrealistic? Or is he just living in a different reality than you? The thing is, reality isn't really out there. It's in here. The nature of the world is imprinted on your mind. It's important to accept that others live in effectively different worlds, that their conclusions make perfect sense to them, and that expecting them to quickly grasp your particular world is most likely a fool's errand. So, good for you. Now you know why everyone else is a dumbass. But hopefully, you've gleaned another basic truth. You're a dumbass too. Each of us comprehends only the tiniest sliver of reality, and we do so in an extremely subjective way. The next time someone accuses you of being biased, agree with them wholeheartedly. We are all very biased.